Movie buff specialist Phil and John are back, and we are continuing to count down our favorite 100 movies of all time. Spoilers abound. If you have never seen either of these movies, that is something that I never remember to say off the top. So, congratulations. If this is your first time listening, welcome. You get the only warning I think I've given in any of the podcasts. But today we are going through our number 95s. Two very different movies from two very different eras of Hollywood. That is for sure. We have the 1938, not original, but pretty much the one that everybody considers the original, The Adventures of Robin Hood, and the 2002 Stephen Daldry suicide movie, The Hours. I don't really know what else to call it other than that. One based on a book, one kind of based on legend, right? I don't know if did Robin Hood actually have a book, or was it mainly just legend?
Eventually it was written into a book. But essentially, we're just taking English folklore when it comes to the story of Robin Hood.
Yeah, absolutely. So another first time for this podcast that I had not seen a movie and John had not seen a movie. So this was both of our first viewings of each other's movies on this list, which should create a pretty interesting conversation because, I mean, The Hours isn't quite 20 years old. The Adventures of Robin Hood is 83 years old. The Adventures of Robin Hood is my grandmother. So let's talk about what just initial reaction to The Hours, John, and obviously we'll get way more in depth as we move forward.
The Hours is a really interesting movie. It's a really interesting movie for me to be watching at this time of the year. The anniversary of my sister's suicide is in 2 weeks. So to be watching a movie about Virginia Woolf, who, like my sister, also suffered from bipolar disorder and committed suicide at this time of the year, it's a little jarring, and my experiences with that make my viewing of movies with suicide really different than most people, because I'm more looking for, how is suicide portrayed in this? Is it being glorified like some terrible, terrible pieces of media do? Is it being shown in a way to help reduce the stigma of suicide and mental health disorders that are often associated with it? And The Hours, I feel, does it so beautifully and really makes you feel each of these characters throughout all three timelines and the struggles they're going through that takes them to this appreciation of life.
Yeah, and I think what works for me with The Hours, and again, just a quick thing, but what works for me with The Hours is ultimately that the entire time Virginia Woolf will ultimately commit suicide. Whether you know the story of Mrs. Dalloway or you don't know the story of Mrs. Dalloway does not impact the other two stories. Right off the top, they show you the first scene of the movie is Virginia Woolf committing suicide. Leonard reading the Stannis the Manus reading the letter, and Virginia Woolf committing suicide. So right off the bat, boom, that's what's going to happen in this movie. It doesn't matter if you know anything else coming into this. I had never known Mrs. Dalloway. I have an MFA in creative writing. I've read one thing by Virginia Woolf. I'll say one thing because I just need to sound like I have something going here. But you don't need to know more than that. You really don't, in order to understand what's going on in this movie and the tone of this movie. Just like with The Adventures of Robin Hood. So The Adventures of Robin Hood, my first time watching this movie, Errol Flynn, quite a guy. What a lad he was. Fun Wikipedia after watching the movie, that's for certain. But so I sat down, I watched this for the first time. I love the Disney animated Robin Hood, probably more than anybody else in the world. That movie is disturbingly close to my top 100 movies of all time. So I really enjoy that one. But this was the first time I'd actually sat down and watched this. The only other version of this that I've seen is Robin Hood Men in Tights. So hello, welcome to my podcast. I quite enjoyed The Adventures of Robin Hood. It's dated, but dated in the good ways of classic Hollywood. It's not dated in like the Birth of a Nation ways of classic Hollywood. It's dated in the, oh, isn't this an enjoyable, fun movie where like, yeah, you can tell that they're not really doing certain things and whatever. But as John, you actually had said to me last week after we podcasted, when you were pitching this movie to me, it is pretty progressive for its time. It's pretty ahead of its time in the themes that it's kind of exploring, which I thought was interesting on this viewing of a movie 83 years old. Very enjoyable. Claude Rains, one of my favorite actors from the classic Hollywood era. So I enjoyed watching that for sure. But that's the movie we're going to be starting with. So we might as well kind of just go into it. John, is The Adventures of Robin Hood your 95th favorite movie of all time?
So I first watched The Adventures of Robin Hood as a kid growing up. In fact, I didn't remember that I had seen it until my mother reminded me last week. Because I had watched it for an English class I was teaching a couple years ago. We were doing a unit on Robin Hood. I had to find the best adaptation to kind of show them the story of Robin Hood. And I was going through everything, and I watched The Adventures of Robin Hood, and I watched it 3 times that week.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's just so fun. When I sat down and watched it again this week, I'm sitting there and I'm watching it with a smile on my face for the entire 2-hour run of this movie. It is so fun the entire way through. There is such a joy that comes from Technicolor. It's such a special way of shooting a film. And when we look at today's day and age where we have sepia tones and everything, seeing that bright contrast of Technicolor with all the brilliant costumes in this movie, it just puts a smile on my face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something about this, and John, I'm sending you a private message, but there's something about this movie with all of the overly done sets and all of that this was directed by Michael Curtis, who goes on to direct what many would consider the greatest movie of the classic Hollywood era. That's for sure. And so, in Casablanca. So I feel like it's understated that it was in the hands of an incredibly talented director. And he's got Claude Rains playing Prince John. You have Errol Flynn, which, this was back in the day where people really did remove who the person was as a human a little bit too much, and then let them go. Olivia de Havilland, great. You have Basil Rathbone, the greatest name arguably in movie history. And all of this just working together, and you see the inspiration for so much in this movie. They always talk about how certain movies it set the tone. It changed the game. We talked about The Last Crusade last week, and Raiders of the Lost Ark gets more credit because it changed the game for action movies, or what changed the game for comedies or silent film, or finally the first talking movie, whatever it is. But I was watching this final scene with Basil Rathbone, who I can't remember his name, and Robin Hood fighting, and I'm like, this is The Princess Bride. Like, this is the actual scene from The Princess Bride when Inigo Montoya is fighting. That is the actual scene from that. And to see that and know that came out 50 years later, about 50 years later, and that's just one instance of this, but still sits so well in my mind. It's pretty incredible. It really is. And I do think that, while ultimately, again, I always like to throw this out there so that, I like pretty much every movie. That's just kind of where it goes. But this would not be one of my top 100 because I don't have that personal connection to it. That's for sure. This is a wholly entertaining movie that does stand the test of time because for all of its, not missteps, but all of its, I can't think of the word, what it can't live up to now. It can't look like The Lord of the Rings. That's impossible. But if you forgive that, and you should, because you're sitting down to watch a movie from 1938, everything else about it is done with the best intentions, and it's done in a very fun and entertaining way that makes you just go, okay, great. Like, that was a fun hour and 42 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. And part of it comes down to the fact that it is just this like larger than life mythological being, essentially, right? We're dealing with this folklore of Robin Hood, who has this deep-seated history. And I mean, now in today's day and age, yes, we did grow up watching the Disney Robin Hood instead of this, right? Mm-hmm. Or we've also gotten to live through all of those wonderful, dark, gritty reboots of Robin Hood.
And the Russell Crowe one is terrible.
Yes, absolutely. But this one, it really captures the whimsy of the tale, and it really captures the idealism behind the idea of the character of Robin Hood. And I think that's what's so important with this movie, is it's still like seeped in metaphor throughout the entire thing, and it has all these ideals to it, which makes it still so relevant today.
Yeah. I mean, this was literally going on in America. If you're listening to this in the future, sorry, but like 2 weeks ago, when the whole Robin Hood stopped the trading, and people were like, well, I thought we were letting the people trade. I thought this was about steal from the rich, give to the poor, give to the needy. How can we make this happen? Obviously, I think of Shrek, where the Robin Hood comes down and starts singing the song. I can't help it every time I hear the word Robin Hood, but this was just happening where people are having that argument of, well, why do they get to benefit from this, but we don't? And that's exactly what this movie is addressing. And yeah, it's set in 1192 or something along those lines, but that doesn't mean that it's central to 1192. And I think that's what sets a movie like this apart from other, I don't want to call it a fairy tale because it's not, but like action adventure / fairy tale movies of the era. And we'll get to one in a couple weeks when we talk about The Wizard of Oz from 1939, which is a year later, which is a similar whimsy. Oh, this is so much fun. Get into it and don't take yourself too seriously. I feel a lot of these movies, they either take themselves too seriously or they don't know what the point of their movie is. And, you know, what's The Wizard of Oz about? There's no place like home. Oh, that's literally a line in the movie. What is Robin Hood about? It's about giving to those in need and taking it from those who don't need it. And they say that in the movie. And I think it's a tale as old as time. It's 83 years old and you would never know it.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that we have this character of Robin Hood and we slowly learn about his character throughout, we learn that he was this noble lord and that he is literally giving up all of his wealth in order to stop the unjust taxation of the Saxon people by the Norman ruling class it's just, it feels so good because you're like, yeah, I feel that way sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally understand what he's doing. And there's the feast scene, when they've captured Sir Guy and Robin's first meeting Lady Marian and everything. And Lady Marian's like, essentially says, what's in it for you? And Robin's just like, reward? You just don't understand. Mm-hmm. Because there is no reward for him. He's not doing it for himself. He's doing it for the betterment of the people. And that's what makes you connect so much to this movie, because it's that good that you hope exists in everyone.
And that's what I think, you know, it's what people hope exists in the politicians they elect. It's what they hope exists in the athletes, in the, you know, we're going to go through this. And I mean, who Errol Flynn is playing in this movie could not be any further from who Errol Flynn was in real life. But it's this hope that the person playing Robin Hood is also like that it's somebody you can look up to, who's got your best interests in mind and is going to be there for you, whether, you know, it's an actor, they're not actually going to be there for you, but they're going to support the causes you want to support. They're going to do all of these things. And yeah, I think it comes across really well in this movie, obviously. And, you know, it's just when he says to her, like, no, they all want to give this to King Richard. They're not doing this so that they can make money. They're doing it for King Richard because they believe in him. They don't believe in Prince John, and they don't believe in getting taxed and not being able to, you know, the whole beginning of this movie, which, you know, I'm sure that something similar to this has been done, but probably in a more Mel Gibson-y Braveheart way of, well, you killed a deer in the forest and now that's against the law. What are we going to do? It probably doesn't play out quite this way in reality, but it is a nice way to express just how dire the situation really is.
Yeah, exactly. And it's all prefaced with this little bit of a prefix. And we have our introduction to Prince John and how he's talking with Sir Guy and how they're talking about the taxation that's going to occur and everything. And Prince John spills this bottle of wine. Mm-hmm. And it's just this metaphor for how much he's going to mess up England. Mm-hmm. And then you see it in the montage that follows where it's showing like the punishment that all the Saxons are going through because of this new taxation. And we get then to the point where the deer gets shot and we finally get our introduction to Robin Hood. And we see that we finally have this character who's standing up to that. And that's what I really like about this movie, is just is transitions, because essentially Robin Hood is a bunch of short stories, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Short stories and different adventures, and we kind of get to go through all the most popular Robin Hood stories in this movie, and they transition to each other so well in the way it's presented here.
Yeah, and I think that's something that older movies especially have a hard time doing, which is not starting off with their main character. I feel like older movies, it was very much follow this structure. And I'm talking older American cinema. Obviously, if you start going elsewhere, things were different because America's not what invented it. There's other ways of telling a story, but in older American cinema, in the Hollywood style, in the classic Hollywood style, it was very much like, this is your protagonist. This is their love interest or whatever they're going after. And now let's focus that way. And I like this movie because they start you off with the villain. And they start you off with the title cards, and you don't see Robin Hood until he actually has to do something. And actually, in this movie, the development of Robin Hood really isn't there. He just kind of shows up, and he's already a badass, and he's already going to do everything. And they have that big dinner scene, the big dinner. I'm talking like when he actually goes to see Prince John, and he stands up to everybody, and they all tackle him and try to beat him up, and he sneaks out somehow, which he doesn't do later in the movie because he needs to be captured at least once. But there's really no character development from Robin Hood. They all know who Robin of Locksley is. They know who he is, what he's about. And that's okay. It's okay to have the other characters telling you what you need to know about this character. So we don't need to dwell on backstory. Kind of like something I would say is going to A Knight's Tale. A Knight's Tale does focus more on, well, how did he get here? I like this better of just, he's there. Just trust us, whatever. It's a fantasy movie. It's a fun movie. Yeah. Just trust us that this is where he belongs and what he's really all about.
Yeah, and the best part is he's not a perfect hero either. He's not this like flawless hero. We see him standing up to Prince John right away and saying, "Nope, you're not my king," and then avoiding capture in the castle somehow. And then we then see him play right into the Sheriff of Nottingham's trap. Because it's his arrogance. He's so arrogant that he can't possibly not compete in this archery competition and A, prove himself to be the best archer in all of England, and B, literally flaunt himself in front of the sheriff.
Yeah. Absolutely. Knowing that if he wins, that's what's going to happen. I love the splitting of the arrow. That's one of my favorites. In the Disney one as well, when he does the double arrow hit and then splits it. I mean, it's all just fantastic. But yeah, he can't help it. He suffers from hubris like so many other great heroes do who ultimately fail. And if this was a more serious movie, he probably would fail. He'd probably be laying on the stretcher at the end of the movie, just like, no offense to anybody who hasn't seen Braveheart. I said spoilers abound, even for movies we don't necessarily have. But William Wallace, he's just laying there and he's getting destroyed. Go listen to what Stuart Scott, the late great Stuart Scott, had to say about what was happening to poor William Wallace at the end of that movie. But that would probably have happened in this. But the tone of this and what this movie is about is the happy version of what good can come of these types of situations, what good can come of others' greeds, how even when your hubris does get in the way, you can overcome it because you've been so good to everybody else that they will ultimately come for you and save you from the hangman's noose and get you out of there and you can escape and all that. It really works. And the one thing I do like about this movie is obviously everything in a movie is always sped up ridiculously fast because it's a movie. But I do like the way that Maid Marian, Lady Marian in this doesn't just immediately fall for him. It actually takes him doing things for her to fall for him. If you watch a 1930s movie not named It Happened One Night, you're probably not going to see the guy actually earn the lady's affection. That is just something that was not happening back then. City Lights, also masterpiece. But those types of movies, for the most part, these movies that were being turned out by the big studios and things like that, it was a lot of, well, they just like each other because that's what they were intended to do. And this one, I actually think that they take a little bit more time with it. And I thought that was an interesting choice that I was not expecting.
I actually really love Lady Marian's character in this movie because she's such an independent woman despite all of this, despite being the ward of the king and everything. Because our introduction to her is like, okay, you're going to marry Sir Guy. She's like, nah,
Mhm.
you can't do that. And then she does not fall for Robin right away. And then she's the one who comes up with the plan to save Robin.
Yeah.
Like, how fantastic is that? In a movie from 1938, to see this independent woman. I mean, this movie fails the Bechdel test,
Yeah.
but it still has this strong, independent woman who isn't just obsessed with Robin, who is just standing up for herself.
And I think a lot of movies in this genre do fail the Bechdel test, but the best movies of this genre, Gladiator, Braveheart, this one, they manage to make those characters work so well. When they have a female character, it works so well. And that's why, you know, the Bechdel test, no test is perfect. The Bechdel test is not a perfect test. It's more of a thing that you can kind of like flip your nose up at movies and be like, see, you never do it. But there's other ways to prove, like, to show that you're making an actually, you know, meaningful movie. Jordan Alford has not seen The Hours. I was wondering where he is. You got to go see The Hours. What's going on here, man? It's Showtime for free. That's how I watched it. Showtime. If you don't have Showtime, go on Amazon, get your 30-day free trial and watch it. But yeah, I do agree. I think her character really works. And then you go and watch the Disney version. Obviously, it's a Disney version. But what happens? They literally just look at each other and their noses wiggle, which is also kind of funny because I think they even say, I think we were made for each other. It's so overblown. I'm a huge fan of the Wolfgang Reitherman movies, the Disney movies. I think he did a great job with all of those. I love his style. But yeah, that was overblown. This one, even though it doesn't take itself super seriously, in certain elements, it really does. And that's one of the elements. The Maid Marian, Lady Marian character is a portion of this movie that they do take very, very seriously.
Yeah, exactly. And this movie doesn't do a lot to focus on many of the side characters. We have these characters that we're familiar with the names of. Like, we have Little John, and we have Will, and we have Friar Tuck, but we're never even told Friar Tuck's name in this movie.
Not until late in the movie.
The friar. Yeah. And we have all of these characters that we know. We don't learn a lot about them, but the movie does such a great job of just putting them there so you know exactly what type of character they are from the small amount of time they are on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And how it all plays together.
And I think they even call him John Little at the beginning of this. And I was like, oh, interesting. Why'd they change it to Little John? And then later in the movie, he calls him Little John. But at the beginning, he introduces himself as John Little, and then that gets changed into Little John, which to me is signaling, oh, yeah, there's that camaraderie. There's that friendship. There's that thing that is happening, that has happened off screen, that has built up this type of relationship. And yeah, the friar is a heavy, good swordsman who just happens to be a good swordsman because that's what he is. And then you have, you know, I actually don't know what is the name of the guy who is like sleeping with Maid Marian's, whatever you call remember. That. Yeah, but he's an interesting character too.
Yeah. And it's funny because his character is introduced at the very beginning as the one who shoots the deer. And that's where we see Robin as this just character because he's like, oh, no, I shot the deer. Mm-hmm. And then this other character becomes indebted to Robin Hood. And you're like, that's kind of weird. Why is he just indebted to him? Mm-hmm. But you see that it's just because like Robin is such this noble guy that people want to follow him. They want to be part of his band. And we see that again with every single character, with Little John, with Friar Tuck, as they go and they add these characters to the merry band because they're all just attracted to the way that Robin approaches things. But he loses to both of those two people in combat, right? I mean, arguably he beats Friar Tuck and then, like, you know, when the swords actually come out. But
yeah,
like he's just creates that type of air to him, which made people want to follow him, which is why you can root for him so well in this movie.
Yeah, I think he doesn't have the hero's journey in this movie, which is what's unique about this. Is that, yes, everybody follows him, and yes, Errol Flynn laughs about 9,000 times. He's doing his best Charlton Heston impersonation, even though Charlton Heston would come years later. But he's doing his best Charlton Heston impersonation of just over laughing and all of that. And we see this as the inspiration for a lot, as I've already said, Gladiator, Braveheart, all these types of movies. I mean, you even see it in Aragorn and The Return of the King, where that's what this is. It's look at this person who I strive to be, even though I can never be them. And now I'm going to follow them. But we always get the arc of that character. William Wallace, how can he go from what he was to what he wants to become? You know, what can Maximus, I think, whatever. But how can he go from what he was to what he wants to become? How can he get his revenge? And really in this one, the person with the least amount of story is Robin Hood. He's more of the idea, and he's the person who kind of drives it. But Maid Marian has a bigger story. Prince John has a much bigger story. And the merry men who we're introduced to all have more motivation than Robin for a lot of the stuff that happens in this movie.
Yeah, and that's the nice thing about Robin Hood. And that's why pulling on folklore is so good for films when they're executed well, because the characters, like your central characters, are themes. They're not actual people, which is what we're so invested in movies nowadays. We want real, gritty characters. At least that's what we've seen for the last 2 decades. But with Robin Hood back in the 30s, where, I mean, we all know the 30s were not a very good time to be alive in. There was a lot of stuff happening then. Wasn't a very happy world. But you have a movie like this, which is so fun, based on this ideal that, hey, there is injustice in this world, and we have to rise to fight against it. It's amazing this movie came out before the war.
Yes, and that was also something, and it didn't come out close. Well, I guess the 1922 version, which was, I guess, the original, did come out, like I just said, 1922. So I guess that's coming on the heels of World War I, but I've never seen that one, and I'll be honest, I probably never will. So I wonder if that one kind of delves into that a little bit more, but I was interested in that this didn't come out in the early 30s, because if you think about a lot, like, think about what happened with Vietnam. A lot of the movies that came out about Vietnam were late 70s, because Vietnam was happening in the late 60s for the most part, or you know, whatever it was. And so it's normally about a decade later. So the fact that this was almost 20 years after the first war had ended, or maybe it was 20 years after the first, when did it actually end? We all know it was around there.
It was 1918.
But then okay, so 1918. I always think it's 1919, you know, but hey, I don't know. But so then 1918, the war ends. 21 years later, this comes out, a few years before World War II. So I do think that I agree with you. It's interesting that this came out not on the heels of a war and not during a war or anything like that. It came out kind of just in the middle of it, and clearly not enough people watched it.
Well, I mean, it depends. Like, your American history, when it comes to like paying attention to events that were happening in Europe at the time, maybe people were just paying attention to the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany at that time. And that's part of the reason why they did this. But in the end, what it is, it's just a fun adventure that has these things. Yeah. It's also because there's so much focus on wealth in this movie as well, and like the distribution of wealth, where you have, I mean, you're in 38, you're in the New Deal, you're in FDR's New Deal at this point, right? And you're looking at more of those like socialist ideals. Ooh, not the scary socialists, but those are the type of ideals that are being pushed on from the government at that point, because it is at the tail end of the Depression. So it makes sense that like there's an aspect of propaganda to this film.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is very much that, hey, we're giving to everybody. Everybody should have their fair share. Everybody should have their, you know, and again, it's, you know, what the socialist message ultimately ends up being, which is, we just want enough for everybody to be able to live. And that's what this movie is saying. No, we still believe in King Richard, but this is what we want to push. Whether you believe that, whether you agree with that or not, whether you believe that or not, that's not what the point is. It's just, that's what this movie is about. You know, it is about that, you know, socialist mentality of, you know, there is a way to get out from under the thumb of an ultimate ruler, which is Prince John, who is taxing us for no reason. You know, we see his people going in and just taking the food and eating it and not paying. Why would we pay you? Blah, blah, blah. While they're expected to pay them back. How can you pay back if you're not getting paid by the people you're expected to pay? It doesn't make any sense. So, you know, it is a hell of a message for 1938. That's for sure.
Yeah. And it really goes into the myth of like Richard the Lionheart as well, and like how revered Richard the Lionheart was of the Saxon people, because I mean this is pretty early into the Norman conquest of England. Once we get into the historical side of things, right? And that's another thing that I really love about this movie is that it didn't shy away from that historical context of the stories, whereas like obviously like the Disney version does sway away from that, because what's the point in telling kids about Normans and Saxons? But because it focuses on that aspect of it, and it really goes to show that Richard the Lionheart was really revered. But it also has this question of like, it's the scene where Richard finally shows up again and they're talking about it. It's like, why did he go away? Why did he go and fight in the Crusades when the people here need him? And like, it puts that responsibility on Richard. And like, even with how little Richard is in this movie, there is that moment of realization of like, I made a terrible mistake because I allowed this to happen. And it really holds the leaders accountable in this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And then obviously you have your Disney-fied ending, which, you know, happens because of Richard realizing his error. But, you know, you hope that most people realize the error of their ways as easily as Richard the Lionheart does in this movie. You know, it's probably never going to happen because it's pretty idealistic, but it is a nice touch. I do like, you know, they're ultimately held accountable. Prince John is held accountable for everything he does. A lot of times that guy kind of wins. We're going to be watching a movie in a couple of weeks where that guy is the kind of guy, you know, and that's a movie that's not actually on either of our lists, but we'll be replacing, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks when that actually comes up. But yeah, it's a well done movie, and some of these movies, you forget that they're classics for a reason. You know, even Gone with the Wind, for all the problematic themes that might be throughout that movie, I don't like that movie. I don't like that movie for numerous reasons that have nothing to do with the recent backlash on that movie. I just think it's an overdrawn, it's just whatever. To me, it bores me. But it's a classic for a reason, and that's because there's something there, the grand scale of it, all of that. And so it's always interesting when you sit down and you watch a movie from that era, from the 30s, from the 40s, where you've never sat down and watched it. Now you're going to watch it 70, 80 years later. And you sit down and you're like, that was really good. Well, the reason it stood the test of time is because of what it's doing. There are a million movies that have come out in that era that were really, really bad that you're not going to sit down and watch and go, wow, that stunk, because it's not considered a classic because everybody's already determined it stunk. Get rid of it. So that's, you know, there's always going to be hidden gems and things like that. But that was one of my biggest things when I sat down and watched this. I'm like, this is a lot better than I was expecting. Also, of course it is, because that's why it's a classic, and that's why it's the one we talk about, and people aren't running out to watch Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, because that's stupid.
Yes.
Sorry,
yeah, exactly. Exactly. And that's like one of the nice things about these movies. And sometimes we forget this when we're watching movies, is we don't take in context the world that was shaping around the movie at the time that it was created. We don't take into context the technology of the movie. I have friends who refuse to watch movies made before the 80s because they're like, oh, it just doesn't look good. It's like, but you have to look at it through the lens of when it was made. And like, that's one of the beautiful things about Robin Hood. And Technicolor was really in its infancy when this movie came out. This is one of the most prolific Technicolor movies.
Absolutely.
Because it is a costume movie, like I had mentioned earlier, where you needed those vibrant colors for these costumes. And that's a big deal. And that's something you don't have to like it, but you have to learn to appreciate it and what it led to further on when it comes to film.
Yeah, people kind of forget that there wouldn't be color movies if it wasn't for Technicolor that looked like this back in the day. I mean, Wizard of Oz, you know, which we talk about in a couple of weeks, but that's a crazy evolution of what Technicolor could do. Gone with the Wind was an evolution of what Technicolor could do. You know, so that's really where it comes from. And I mean, I don't know how they're your friends if they don't watch movies from before 1980, because like, have they never seen like Cinderella? Have they never seen like Sleeping Beauty? Like, what do they do? What do they like? They never seen Jaws. God, when I found out my fiance hadn't seen Jaws, I almost broke up with her on the spot. But anyway, anything else you want to say about the Adventures of Robin Hood before we move on to its, you know, same movie that came out 74 years later?
Nope. Just like, give yourself a chance, guys. If you anyone who's listening to this who hasn't had taken their time to watch movies from this era because they are old, because you don't think you'll relate to them, because you don't think they are relevant today, give them a shot. There's so much. Some of them are incredibly fun. Some of them are just really good. When we're looking at Michael Curtis's other work, obviously, which Phil and I both have way, way higher up on our lists.
Yeah.
These movies are classics for a reason. Take a watch of them with an open mind and just think about the context these movies were made in and enjoy them, because that's what this era of Hollywood was. It was film for film's sake, for enjoyment, and that's what The Adventure of Robin Hood is.
Yeah. People weren't thinking about anything but like, how can we make people entertained by this? And I think that's something that gets missed on a lot of people. And clearly I'm not a history major. I couldn't tell you when World War I ended earlier. And I'm clearly not a math person, because 2002 minus 1930 is not 74, it is 64. So let's jump 64 years into the future, John. And let's talk about a movie that is not similar to The Adventures of Robin Hood really in any way, shape, or form. Except for it's only about 10 minutes longer. So I guess they're about the same length. Look, some things never change. But sit down, watch The Hours. John's first time. I've grown to love this movie. So the first time I watched this movie was back in like 2003. I was like 10, 11 years old. Hard movie to watch as a 10, 11-year-old. A lot of movies from 2002 I should not have been watching that I was watching. My parents pretty much had a policy. If there's no nudity, sure, whatever, watch it. So I'm sitting down, I'm watching this, I'm watching Adaptation, I'm watching Chicago, I'm watching Gangs of New York. I had no idea what the hell was going on in 2002. I understood The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. Okay, great, we're moving on. So this movie comes out then. I didn't like it. Of course I didn't like it. My parents didn't like it, so it never really became one of those movies that I rewatched for a long time. After college was actually the first time I watched this movie again, which puts me about 2015. I finally watched this movie again, and I was like, there's something about that movie. There's something going on here. And so I started it started kind of like just stirring in my brain. And then I watched it again, and then I watched it again. And now I've probably seen this movie almost 10 times, because there's just something about this movie. To me, even though it is a movie that is ultimately about depression and suicide and all these heavy, heavy themes, this movie somehow, some way gives me hope when it ends. And I know that's a hard thing maybe to understand, because the last shot is Virginia Woolf about to drown herself. But there's something about this movie that does give me hope. And I think it's in the fact that the other storylines end the way they do, which we'll talk about. But, as somebody who writes and tries to write and wants to do all that stuff, this is a movie, every time it ends, I'm like, I have to write now. Like, I need to sit down and I need to write. I need to seize this day. I need to do whatever it is. I sit down, I listen to Philip Glass's incredible score, and I just go. It just flows out of me. And I don't know. There's just something about this movie. I think it is, for a lot of these movies, I have Crash on my list. I know a lot of people don't like Crash. I don't care if you don't like it. I like it. That's what this is about. But a lot of these movies that try to handle multiple storylines over multiple timelines and stuff like that, a lot of them falter. And I feel like this one is so incredibly well paced, and you get so deep into the minds of these three women. And I think what really helps that is that this movie is ultimately about how the little ordinary things are what ultimately drive you over the edge. And so those are the things we can all relate to. There's no big murder. There's no big cheating scandal. There's nothing like that. It's just, she wanted to bake a good damn cake. She wants to throw a party. And Virginia Woolf just wants to write a really good book and be left alone. And I think that we can all relate to those types of things. But John, it was your first time watching it. That's why it's my number 95. What do you got?
I ultimately don't think this movie is about like the mental illness and the suicide and everything. I actually think this is a very hopeful movie. I think this movie is more rooted in its ideas of an appreciation of life. And it's rooted in these three timelines that it seemed pretty innocuous at the beginning. Why are these three timelines important? Like, how are they related? Why is the story being told this way? But as we go on and learn more, and we learn more about like the title of the movie and where the title comes from, it becomes really clear. Just like, it's about these little things in life that make you appreciate it so much. And that's ultimately what I get out of this movie, is just life is so precious that we need to appreciate it.
Yeah. And so for me, this ending I know is quite a polarizing ending. You know, it really is, with her going on and coming and showing up. And for me, when Julianne Moore says to Meryl Streep, and I can never remember their name, Clarissa Vaughn, I try to go by their names, but then I always just go the other way. You know who Meryl Streep is, you know who Julianne Moore is. But when she sits down and she says to her, "It was death, I chose life."
Mm-hmm.
Everybody in the theater, everybody who's watched that movie has said, "Man, she is a horrible person." But at the same time, how many people actually come to that all the time? Not this. This is obviously an extreme, leaving your family behind, leaving your children, saying goodbye. Your second child is born, and you just vanish. You're never there again. But it's that whole, we're in this situation that we feel is what we're supposed to do. And it's the only way that we can live our lives. But in reality, it's killing us. Every single day, it's killing us. How can we get out of it? And how can we get better? And how can we move on from that? And I just think it's it's one line. It's not a line that's going to show up on AFI's top 100 movie quotes. It's not a line that's going to show up in people's bios on Letterboxd and on, you know, whatever else they put their favorite movie quotes on. But to me, it's one of the most powerful lines in movie history because it just resonates with everything. And how many times have you been in a situation where you're like, do I quit or do I keep going? It was death, I chose life. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant.
No, absolutely. And Julianne Moore's character in this is fantastic. I think Julianne Moore's performance in this is amazing. I think Meryl Streep's obviously amazing. This cast in general is incredible.
Yeah, we're going to get into that. It's insane.
And then there's Nicole Kidman's fake nose.
My fiance watched it for the first time and goes, I don't think I realized that every movie I've seen of Nicole Kidman was after she got her nose done. I go, no, this is a prosthetic. That's not real.
Yeah. I was like, oh, that's a really noticeable prosthetic there.
Mm-hmm. She's unrecognizable in the movie.
She is completely unrecognizable. And she also does a phenomenal job in this film. Mm-hmm. And it's all pulled together with that fantastic Philip Glass score. But Julianne Moore's character really sums up a lot of this movie, because I feel like she's more the main character of this movie. Despite the fact that we spend more time with Meryl Streep's character, I really feel that, what was her name? Laura Brown, right?
Laura Brown,
the character. Yeah. She is what we're supposed to feel this movie through. And there's the scene where she's in the kitchen with Toni Collette's character and explaining the novel to her. And it's about this woman who's going through a party, and like everything seems great, but then like it's not. And it's like, yeah, I feel that. I understand that, because there are so many times in life where we are looking at people and we think everything's okay and it's not. And like that's this mental illness thing. And of course, Virginia Woolf suffered from bipolar disorder. And of course, during her life, it was just classified as like her madness. Mm-hmm. But in retrospect, it was very clearly bipolar disorder. And that's such a debilitating thing to suffer from. And it's something that people who don't suffer from bipolar disorder can fully grasp and understand. So to see this movie kind of putting it in a way where it just like puts to words these feelings that people have when they do suffer from mental illness. And that's even something as small as like depression. Of course, depression isn't small, but like in the
something as understandable as depression.
Understandable
so many people,
today, right? In today's day and age, when we do really acknowledge that a very large percentage of the population does suffer from depression, but it goes undiagnosed because people aren't paying attention to it, or they don't know how to put it in words. And to have this film just put it out there like that, it seems like everything's okay, but it really isn't. It just hits you.
Yeah, and I mean, you're starting to get the behind the scenes doing this podcast with me now. You know how many times I don't want to do this. You know how many times I don't want to hop on, but you put on the face. And how many times do people go to work and they don't want to put on the face? They just put on the face. They just do what they have to do. And what I love about this movie is that every character is called out.
Mhm.
Every character, it's what's wrong. Something wrong, something's off. Jeff Daniels, Lewis Waters comes in, barely in this movie, comes in one scene. What's wrong? What is going on with you? Explain it to me. And there is no explanation for it. And I think that's what works so well. What does Laura Brown do before she goes off to kill herself? Which she ultimately doesn't end up killing herself. But what does she do as her last action? She remakes a cake so her husband will come home to a perfect cake. It had to be a perfect cake before she goes. Now explain, Laura, why you did that. You can't. You can't, but there's something in her that's saying to her, I at least want him to have that before I leave. And you say she's the main character. I actually believe, and it's harder to pitch, but Nicole Kidman wins Best Actress for this, not supporting actress. And we're going to get into all this because it's a chaotic year, this 2020, 2002. I actually think Richie is the main character of this movie. Mm-hmm. And I think Richie, and this isn't so much of a think. I think this is, something that's probably pretty understood for anybody who's watched The Hours more than once, which probably isn't much of the population. But Richie is the substitute for Virginia Woolf because Virginia Woolf can't be in these others. And the women are being portrayed as the substitute for Virginia Woolf, where it's like, oh, they're going to kill themselves or something bad is going to happen to them or whatever. But ultimately, they get over what they need to get over. They figure it out. And it's Richie who is left out in the dark this entire movie to suffer, much the way that Virginia Woolf feels like she is suffering in the country. She needs the city. She needs that. And Richie, with his parents, what's going on with that, grows up, has AIDS, is dying, doesn't feel like anything he's ever done in his life is worthwhile. To me, it's just a substitute for Virginia Woolf. So that's where like the two of them are kind of the main characters, more so even than Meryl Streep and Julianne Moore, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that statement. The moment where you realize that Richard is Richie is so powerful. It's just like, this is our through line. This is where it connected.
Yep.
And it just makes so much sense. The movie made so much more sense at that point.
Yeah.
And at that point is also when Virginia Woolf has her epiphany of like, I'm not going to kill off.
It's the poet who has to die.
It's the poet who has to die. And then her husband just asks, well, why does someone have to die? And she says, someone has to die so that the rest of us value life more. Mm-hmm. What a powerful line. And
that's exactly what happens.
Exactly. Yeah. And it brings back Laura Brown into this point where she's like acknowledging that, yes, she was not a very good mother, but she chose life instead of death, right? And it brings Meryl Streep's character to this point to kind of realize like she has this facade going on of like what's actually happening or what she's trying to make this perfect party and everything. But there are more important things in life.
Yeah. Yeah, and she's living for somebody else. And I think ultimately what the message of this movie is, whether you're a parent who's like, get out of here, I'm never going to leave my kids behind, or you're just a person who's like, all right, I have a friend who's ill or whatever it is you have to live for you. And Virginia Woolf killing herself is the extreme version of Leonard, you have to live for yourself. You can't keep doing this for me. Go live your life. Julianne Moore leaving her children and her family, go live your life. Meryl Streep at the end of the movie, we see her smile and the sense of relief. And obviously it all goes to the fact that one of the greatest casts ever assembled in a movie in the history of film, and I'm not exaggerating, this could arguably be the most talented cast ever put into a movie, which might ultimately lead to some people being disappointed. But you have Toni Collette, you have Nicole Kidman, Julianne Moore, Meryl Streep. So let's just do Julianne Moore, Meryl Streep, Nicole Kidman. Nicole Kidman wins the Oscar, beats Julianne Moore for another movie because Julianne Moore was also in Far From Heaven. Julianne Moore was a 2-time nominee that year because she was also nominated for supporting actress for The Hours. Meryl Streep couldn't be nominated for supporting actress for The Hours because she was too busy being nominated for supporting actress for adaptation. So she was not, she couldn't, you can't be nominated twice in the same category at the Oscars. That's just a rule they have. So Julianne Moore was able to do it because she was in different categories, but all of that being said. So that's just the three of them. John C. Reilly that year was in 3 movies nominated for Best Picture. Chicago, he gets nominated for that, so he can't be nominated for The Hours. Not that he would have been. Chicago, and then Gangs of New York. Ed Harris gets nominated for this. Toni Collette, Stephen Delane, who ends up going on, as I said, to be Stannis the Manus. Margot Martindale literally plays a smoking woman. She's in it for 2 seconds. She's amazing. Yep. Then you keep going. Claire Danes, Jeff Daniels, Allison Janney. I feel like I'm leaving people out. It is one of the most insane cast ever assembled. If you look at the hardware of those people, the amount of awards that have been won by the people in this movie, and Stephen Daldry, who in my opinion is a very hit or miss director. I think he's very, very hit or miss. I think he gets too much Academy love. I think he just gets love because he's very by the book. He's ultimately a stage director. That's why a lot of this movie feels like stage, which I personally like, but I could understand if that turned some people off. What was that?
I also really like it when
I think it works.
Aesthetic in a film.
I think it works, especially in this movie, because it's letting you know, like, hey, this is fake. This isn't real. And you kind of need that one thing. Otherwise, it's too depressing. But Stephen Daldry does a great job with this. And then you add in that score by Philip Glass. To me, it just works on every level. And all of these characters, all of these women, all of these men, you feel for them all so much. The one little line of Laura Brown saying, yeah, Dan died really young of cancer. It's like it rips your heart out. John C. Reilly's character is so happy in the moments that we see him in this movie. He's got his family. He's got his wife. This is all he ever wanted. He has it all. We don't need to see him lose his wife.
No.
We just know he lost her. And then we hear the line that, oh, and he died very young. He died before he even died of cancer. He died when she left because that's what he was living for. And it's like the cancer, again, is that metaphor of live for yourself. You weren't living for yourself, and then you end up, it's just, there's so many layers to it, and it just keeps going and going and going and going and going and going. And it's just, I don't know. Insane cast, insane movie. Chicago shouldn't have won Best Picture. Everybody can get mad at me. I don't give a shit. Chicago should not have won Best Picture. But hey, we're going to talk about a lot of movies from 2002 that I have on my list. I think this is a very underappreciated year for movies. With a lot of the ones I just mentioned, not Gangs of New York. I don't really like Gangs of New York. But with a lot of the other ones, Adaptation, City of God came out this year. A lot of just top to bottom, enjoyable, not necessarily enjoyable, but really good for the genre they were in. And even Chicago, very good musical. You know, they just made movies for the genre they were in. And this was just a year where The Pianist was a war drama. The Hours was a drama. The Lord of the Rings was a huge action set piece movie. Chicago is a musical. Adaptation is this like witty, right? They all just nailed their genres that year. Right. That was long. I give you permission to speak now, John.
It's just this idea. Yes, 2002 was amazing for movies, and part of me is a little jealous that we were so young in 2002 that we couldn't fully appreciate it at the time. But it's okay because we can go back to movies.
Hey, 2001 and 2002, great back-to-back years that my parents just did not value.
And this movie itself is just, honestly, if you hadn't suggested this movie, I don't think I would have picked it up at some point. I might have, but I'm really glad that you did because it really is a fantastic movie. It's shot beautifully. The fact that Philip Glass, one of the most prolific and influential composers of the late 20th century, wrote the score to this, and it just drives the emotions you're feeling the entire time in this movie. And then the fact that we're taking such a downright depressing topic as mental health and suicide, and then using it to tell this positive message of don't waste your time. Don't worry about living your life for others because you need to live it for yourself first. It's just so uplifting despite all the aesthetic on it. And like, it's other than the 1950s timeline, aesthetically, it's a very dark movie.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that elevator that Meryl Streep rides in the entire time is brutal. I mean, that's like my nightmare. I hate elevators in general. I've been stuck in one. It's terrible. So that elevator is a nightmare. That, the graffiti. I mean, you just see that Richard at that time is just at the ultimate lowest of lows, and there's no rebounding from it. And that's what's so brutal about it is he knows. And when she says there's good days ahead, and he's like, no, there isn't. Like, no, there isn't. And then that whole speech at the end about what about the hours after the party, all of those where I just sit here and I stare out my window. Like, what's the point of it? And so I think that's what ends up really working in this movie is that it's telling you not to lose hope, but it's also telling you that like you need to find hope in your own ways. You like, yes, you have to try to help people as much as you can, but you have to do everything that you can in order to just continue to live your life. Because while she's helping Richard, her relationship with her girlfriend is failing. Her relationship with all of her ex-friends are failing. Her relationship with her daughter is failing. It's all falling apart around her because she's so focused on one thing and not on how can she make everything around her better? The 50s one is so overly done as 50s California that it has to be bright and sunshiny because otherwise it would have been like, when did it start raining? But yeah, I don't know. I just feel like they did a great job with the pacing and with what they left in and what they left out. And these characters who come in for one scene and disappear and the characters who get their big moments. Leonard getting his massive moment. It was done out of love. That whole speech. Virginia Woolf getting both of her bookends of, always the hours. And then at the beginning, her speech to him. These big moments, they just work. And I don't know. It's some people, like you said, you might've missed this one. I think this is the most missed movie probably of 2002 because it is such a good year. Or if you're trying to find something from that era, 2001 was a very good year. 2003 was pretty good, not as good as these 2 years, but there's other movies that people are just more inclined to throw on. This doesn't show up on top 100 lists, top 10 lists, top movies of the 21st century, whatever. It doesn't show up there. And I mean, should it? Maybe, maybe not. Like, I don't know. It's really a preferential thing. This isn't a movie that broke the mold. This isn't this isn't a Vertigo, Citizen Kane, whatever you want to go with as your break the mold movie. This wasn't that, but it's just a great movie with a great story and great performances. And like, that's ultimately what a movie should have. And I just feel people don't talk about it pretty much ever.
Yeah, I feel like it's one of those movies where you look at the cast for the movie and the year it came out and the theme of the movie, and you're like, oh, this must just be some like Oscar bait movie.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so much better than that. Mm-hmm. There's just so much depth to this movie. The fact that it's constantly questioning, it's a very existential movie where it's just questioning what is life, what makes life important. And those other movies that we've mentioned from this year just don't really go as deep into those topics. Mm-hmm. And it's such a shame that people avoid movies like these. And I get it. Once I started watching it, I was like, oh, this will be fun. But it was so well done that I couldn't stop paying attention to it. And despite the fact that it did hit so close to home from personal experiences, I feel like it did it in a way where I could really appreciate what it was trying to say.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, these other movies, they probably weren't trying to do that. I hope that, adaptation is definitely trying to do that. And I have adaptation much higher on my list. But yeah, it's these types of movies get overlooked a lot. Period pieces in general, or anything that involves a period piece, because this really isn't, yes, there's period elements to this, but this isn't a period piece. But another movie that's on my top 100 is Atonement. And there was another one that comes out in 2007 with There Will Be Blood. And, There Will Be Blood, though, it's allowed to be a period piece because look how cool it is. And it's like, but Atonement, that's just a costume drama. We don't like that. Yeah. There's so much more depth to that. And Oscar bait, I feel, is a very bad word because it's something that just gets lumped in with any movie that just has good acting and good actors attached to it that comes out around Oscar time. That's not Oscar bait. That just is a movie that's coming out at Oscar time because it's really that good. And The Hours came out, Oscar season, December something of 2002 or whatever, just 2001, whatever it was, before the Oscar year. So I guess 2002 going into 2003. Yeah, of course it's going to come out at that time. That's the time of the year for these types of movies to come out. This isn't a summer blockbuster. This isn't going to compete with any of those types of things. But it serves its purpose. It does what it's supposed to do. And I wish people would get rid of the label of Oscar bait, because yes, there was a period where, the English Patient wins and Shakespeare in Love, which I have on my list, but that's another one that wins. And a lot of these movies, and people start to feel like, oh, well, they're just going to win because that's what there's depth to these. There's depth, and there's more to them than what you're seeing on the cover, on the DVD cover, or on the poster.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same reason why there are people who won't watch The Adventures of Robin Hood because it's old.
Yeah.
Right? People have stigmas attached to films, which prevent them from exploring these films and seeing how good they really are.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you're a big movie fan, if you're listening to this podcast, you're obviously a big movie fan, because you didn't find us from us being mainstream. You didn't find us for anything like that. You're listening because you like our taste in movies, or because you like what we've talked about so far, or whatever. You just try them all. Even if you don't like them all, just try them. You know what I mean? And that's been something I've been doing, like with Letterboxd and stuff. I put out a watch list, and then I went through like the top 100 movies that I, were on some list, and ones I hadn't seen, I was like, put it on the watch list, and I'll just shuffle it and throw it on. Some of them I don't really love. Some of them I really do. Some movies that are probably going to win Best Picture in 2021, such as Nomadland, I didn't really care for. But you know what? Like, I'm going to go see it. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to watch it. Maybe, you got to just like see. And if you're that big of a movie fan, try out these movies that you might say, I'm never going to like that. When I saw Atonement? I saw Atonement in like 2013 or 2012. Me and my dad sat down. We watched No Country for Old Men. We watched There Will Be Blood. We sat there on Golden Globe night. And when Atonement won Best Drama, we said, oh, that movie's stupid. Neither one of us had seen Atonement, but we were mad that it beat those other two movies. You know what my favorite movie out of those three is? Atonement. Like, it's so crazy how that's just the reaction for a lot of these types of things. And I think a lot of it, as we'll get into in later episodes here, and not so much with this one, but The Hours did win Best Drama at the Golden Globes. And I think a lot of times movies get a bad rap because they win some sort of Oscar or Golden Globe or award, and what they beat people are more happy with, or more popular, or something along those lines. And then ultimately it leaves a bad reputation, whether it be Crash or Shakespeare in Love or Chicago in the Hours, because they beat the Two Towers, which, they shouldn't have beaten the Two Towers, but they beat the Two Towers for whatever award they won. And I think people a lot of times haven't seen the movie that beat it, or go into it with such a negative tone that they're like, oh, this is going to be stupid. How many people have actually sat down and watched Shakespeare in Love and said, I'm going to watch this because I want to watch it, and not because as soon as you turn it on, you go, oh, this is the movie that beat Saving Private Ryan. Oh, and then every scene you go, oh. It's like a boxing match. It's like, just watch the damn movie. And I feel like that's a problem, with awards and giving awards to anything. You're always going to have that debate of, well, it shouldn't have. The Hours is an unfortunate one that falls into that, because it gets forgotten and it beats stuff. And it's just like, bring it back. How do we get people to sit down and watch that movie?
This podcast, hopefully. Although I've talked so much tonight, probably because I'm just coming off the heels of the other damn podcast. I'm like in talking mode now. But no, this is a fun episode to me in terms of the two movies we covered, because I do like how different they are in terms of scale, in terms of time period, in terms of what they were trying to accomplish. And yet I think both of them accomplish exactly what they were trying to accomplish. And if you go into both of these movies with an open mind, which is a great way to preface what's going to be coming next week, you're probably going to at least enjoy them, or be entertained by them. And, ultimately that's what movies are supposed to do. Yeah.
All right. So speaking of next week, John and I are taking our first trip to the 1990s. Now, both of us have, or I guess you had a movie already. You had Toy Story, but both of us have a good amount of 90s movies on our lists. But this is this is my first journey and John's second journey into the 90s. Next week, we are going to be talking about Darkman from 1990 and Barcelona from 1994. Now, everything I just said about having an open mind and all of that, if you've never seen either of these movies, which I would not be shocked if none of you have, and that's not me being a snob, that's just me. I just saw Barcelona for the first time maybe a year ago. Never seen Darkman. If you haven't seen these movies, go in with an open mind, because everything John has said about Darkman and everything I've told him about Barcelona, and I know about Barcelona because I watched, You're gonna have to have an open mind, otherwise you're gonna be very, very confused coming into next week. What says you, John?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is kind of the first of a couple of forays into B movies for me with next week's entry. And B movies aren't for everyone, but if you go in expecting a B movie, Darkman is a fun ride featuring 2 future Oscar winners.
There you go. And Barcelona, people always ask me, like, we get a lot of independent film now in the 2000s, 2010s. A lot of it is very pretty because everybody can afford a really expensive camera now. It's not that hard to rent them. But a lot of times the dialogue's not great. The story isn't great. They kind of sacrifice that to make it look good and be like, I'm brooding, I'm sad. The 90s weren't like that. Independent film in the 90s was very Chasing Amy, Kevin Smith, low budget, Noah Baumbach, such as that. Whit Stillman was the king of low budget, in my opinion, in the 1990s. His movies look like shit because it's all about the dialogue and it's about the characters, and they talk like they are talking at the audience. They are not having a normal conversation. Nobody would have these conversations. Whit Stillman is telling you, my characters know they are in a movie and they are talking about things that do not have sequiturs. So that is what I say about Barcelona. It's actually the second in a trilogy. So I will say this. It's not a real trilogy. It's not like the Lord of the Rings or Godfather or anything like that, but he calls it a trilogy. Criterion sells it as a trilogy now. If you are a completionist and you're somebody who wants to watch these types of things in order, Metropolitan first, then watch this one. Although Metropolitan, I didn't even realize the main character of Barcelona was in Metropolitan when I sat down and watched Barcelona literally 3 days later. So it's not that big of a deal. But if you are one of those people who just wants to do it for the sake of doing it, watch Metropolitan and then sit down and watch Barcelona. And good luck if you're not into those types of movies, because that's going to be a hell of a 3.5 hours for you. So anyway, John, fun as always. I'm exhausted. I need to stop talking. We'll be back next week. Same time, same place. Hope you're all enjoying this. Hit that like button. Follow Survivor Specialist on Twitter. That's where we kind of make our little updates. Not that we talk much about the movie podcast, but do it. Spread the word to whoever is a movie fan out there. Follow us on Letterboxd, J Millsip, P Wood 43. And that's it. Hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next week.